The September afternoon sun filtered through the maple trees in my son David's backyard, casting dancing shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn where 7-year-old Emma's birthday party was in full swing. I sat in my usual spot, a weathered wooden chair positioned strategically in the corner of the patio, close enough to watch but far enough to avoid the chaos of running children and their animated parents. My arthritic hands gripped the arms of the chair as I watched Emma tear through, her presence with the unbridled enthusiasm only a child could possess. Her golden curls bounced with each movement, reminding me so much of my late wife Margaret when she was young. The thought brought both warmth and a familiar ache to my chest. "More cake, Grandpa Joe?" Emma had asked earlier, her blue eyes sparkling with joy as she held up a paper plate decorated with cartoon princesses. I had nodded, accepting the oversized slice, even though my appetite wasn't what it used to be. At 83, food was more about sustenance than pleasure. But seeing Emma's smile made every bite worthwhile as the afternoon wore on. I found myself increasingly aware of the conversations happening around me. David's wife Susan was entertaining her book club friends near the outdoor kitchen, their voices carrying across the yard in waves of laughter and animated discussion. The younger relatives, cousins, nephews, and their spouses had formed their own clusters, nursing beers and sharing stories about their careers, their children's achievements, and their weekend plans. I recognized most of the faces, though some names escaped me these days. There was Michael, David's younger brother, who worked in tech and always seemed to have his phone in hand. His wife, Jennifer, was chasing their 2 toddlers around the yard while simultaneously trying to maintain a conversation with Susan's sister. Then there were the cousins from Margaret's side of the family, the Patterson kids. As I still thought of them, though they were all in their 40s now, with children of their own, what struck me most wasn't who was there, but how invisible I seemed to be. When I had arrived earlier, there had been the obligatory greetings, quick hugs, polite inquiries about my health, and promises to catch up later that never materialized. Now, as the party reached its peak, I might as well have been part of the patio furniture. "Did you see how slow he was walking in?" I caught a fragment of conversation from near the drinks table. The voice belonged to Michael's wife, Jennifer, though she was trying to keep her tone low. "Poor thing can barely make it up the front steps anymore." "I know," came another voice, one I recognized as belonging to cousin Patricia, Margaret's niece. "David's been worried about him living alone in that big house. I think it's time they started looking at assisted living options." My jaw tightened. I wanted to stand up to walk over there and tell them that my hearing was just fine, "Thank you very much," and that I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. But my legs felt heavy, and the energy required for such a confrontation seemed beyond my reach. Instead, I remained seated, pretending to watch Emma's friends play tag while their words cut deeper than they probably intended.
"Ow."
"He just sits there," Patricia continued, glancing in my direction before quickly looking away. "Doesn't really contribute to conversations anymore. It's like he's already half gone, you know?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Half gone? Is that really how they saw me? As some fading relic taking up space at family gatherings? I thought about all the birthday parties I had attended over the years, first for David and Michael, when they were Emma's age, then for the grandchildren who followed. I remembered being the one organizing games, telling stories, and making sure everyone felt included. When had I become the one who needed including? A burst of laughter from the children's corner momentarily drowned out the adult conversations. Emma was showing off some new Toya elaborate dollhouse that probably cost more than my first car. The kids were genuinely impressed, their excitement infectious even to my jaded old ears. Children had a way of living completely in the moment, unencumbered by the weight of years or the complexity of adult relationships. I envied them that simplicity. When your 7 birthday parties are pure magic, cake tastes better, the games are more fun, and every adult in your life seems like a source of potential adventure. You don't notice if Grandpa's moving slower or if his stories are getting repetitive. You don't whisper about assisted living or worry about someone being a burden. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the yard in shades of gold and amber. I checked my watch, nearly 4 o'clock. The party would probably wind down soon, and I could make my polite excuses and head home to the quiet comfort of my empty house. Maybe I'd heat up some leftover soup and watch the evening news, then fall asleep in my recliner like I did most nights. "Grandpa Joe, are you okay?" Emma's voice broke through my melancholy thoughts. She had approached my chair with her characteristic concern, her small hand reaching out to touch my arm. Even at 7, she had inherited her grandmother's intuitive nature. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I managed, forcing a smile. "Just enjoying watching you have fun." She studied my face with the intensity only children possess when they sense something isn't quite right. "You look sad. Do you want to see my new dollhouse? It has real lights and everything." Before I could respond, Susan appeared behind Emma, her hostess smile firmly in place. "Emma, honey, don't bother Grandpa Joe. He's probably tired from all the excitement." She gently guided Emma away, but not before I caught the meaningful look she exchanged with Jennifer. Tired. There was that word again. As if fatigue was my defining characteristic, the only thing worth noting about my presence. I wasn't tired, I was frustrated, hurt, and increasingly angry at being dismissed so easily. But expressing any of those emotions would only confirm their suspicions that I was becoming difficult, another burden for the family to manage. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and I found myself studying the faces around me. These were my people, my family, my blood, my legacy. Yet I felt more disconnected from them than ever. When had the gap between us grown so wide? When had I stopped being a person and started being a problem to be solved? David appeared at my elbow, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want some caffeine, Dad," he said, settling into the chair beside me. His presence was immediately comforting, a reminder that not everyone saw me as invisible. "Thanks, son." I accepted the warm cup gratefully, noting how David had prepared it exactly the way I liked, black with just a touch of sugar. Great party. "Emma seems to be having a wonderful time, she is. She was asking about you earlier, wondering if you were going to tell one of your stories." David's voice carried a note of something I couldn't quite identify. Pride? Concern? I told her maybe later when things quieted down a bit. I nodded, though we both knew later would probably never come. The party was already beginning to show signs of winding down. Parents were gathering scattered toys. The older children were starting to display the telltale signs of sugar crashes and overstimulatla as we sat together in comfortable silence. I couldn't help but wonder what David really thought about. His aging father? Did he share his relatives' concerns about my independence? Was he, too, having conversations about assisted living and my ability to care for myself? The thought was too painful to pursue, so I pushed it aside and focused on the warmth of the coffee and the familiar comfort of my son's presence. The first chapter of what would become the most important evening of my life was drawing to a close, though I had no way of knowing it yet. All I knew was that I felt smaller somehow, diminished by the casual dismissal of people who should have known better. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before everything changes, we're given a gift, the gift of recognizing just how much we have to lose and just how much we're worth fighting for. The late afternoon air carried the scent of autumn leaves and barbecue smoke as the birthday party began its inevitable transition from celebration to cleanup. I remained in my corner chair, watching as parents corralled their sugar-high children and began the familiar ritual of gathering scattered belongings. David had excused himself to help Susan with the dishes, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing awareness that I had somehow become a spectator in my own, his family's life. Emma had found her way back to me, clutching her new doll and chattering excitedly about all the presents still waiting to be unwrapped. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a few precious minutes, I forgot about the whispered conversations and dismissive glances. This was what mattered, this connection with my granddaughter, this reminder of why family gatherings existed in the first place. "Grandpa Joe, will you come see my room when we go inside?" Emma asked, her small hand finding mine with the casual affection that only children possess. "Mommy put up new curtains, and I have a reading corner now, just like you suggested." The memory came flooding back months ago during one of my weekly visits. Emma had complained about not having a good place to read her bedtime stories. I had suggested creating a special corner with comfortable cushions and good lighting, drawing from my own childhood memories of the reading nook my mother had created for me in our little house in Ohio. I was touched that Susan had followed through on the idea. "I'd love to see it, sweetheart," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Maybe we can pick out a good book to read together." "Really," Daddy says? "You used to tell the best stories when he was little," said you would make. Up adventures about brave soldiers and heroes. Emma's eyes were bright with anticipation. Unaware of the complicated emotions her innocent words stirred in me, before I could respond, I heard my name mentioned in a conversation taking place near the sliding glass door. The speaker's cousin, Patricia, and her husband Mark weren't making any effort to lower their voices, apparently assuming I was either too far away or too deaf to overhear. "Honestly, I think Joe's getting worse," Patricia was saying, her tone carrying that particular mix of concern and frustration that family members reserve for discussing elderly relatives. "Did you see how long it took him to get out of the car earlier? And he barely said 2 words during dinner last week." Mark nodded sympathetically. "It's hard watching someone you care about decline like that. My dad went through the same thing before we had to move him to memory care. The signs are all there, the social withdrawal, the confusion, the way he just sits there looking lost." Grip tightened on Emma's hand, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Lost? Is that really how I appeared to them? I wasn't lost. I was listening, observing, thinking about things they couldn't possibly understand. But their words cut deep because they echoed my own fears about what old age might hold for me. "The thing is," Patricia continued, lowering her voice slightly, "David's in denial about it. Still thinks his dad is the same, sharp, independent. Man he's always been, but the rest of us can see what's happening. Joe needs more help than he's willing to admit." Emma had released my hand and was now arranging her doll's tiny accessories, completely absorbed in her play. She was blissfully unaware of the conversation that was dissecting my mental competence just a few yards away. I envied her that innocence, that ability to exist in the moment without the weight of others' judgments pressing down on her shoulders. "Remember how he used to be?" Mark asked, his voice taking on a nostalgic tone. "Always had a story to tell, always knew exactly what to say to make you feel better. He was like the foundation of this family, strong, reliable, always there when you needed him." The past tense stung was like, used to be, as if I had already died and they were discussing my memory rather than my present reality. I wanted to stand up and walk over there to tell them that I was still here, still thinking, still caring about my family's well-being. But I also knew that any attempt to defend myself would likely be seen as confirmation of their concerns, evidence of confusion or agitation that would only reinforce their narrative about my decline. "It's so sad," Patricia sighed. "I mean, he's lived such an interesting life. All those stories about the war, about building his business from nothing, about raising David and Michael after Margaret died. Now he just ... exists. It's like watching a light slowly fade, a light slowly fade." The metaphor was poetic, but it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I thought about all the conversations I had participated in over the years, all the advice I had given, all the problems I had helped solve. When had my contributions stopped being valued? When had my presence become something to be tolerated rather than celebrated? Emma looked up from her doll, sensing something in my posture or expression. "Are you okay, Grandpa? You look sad again?" Forced another smile, this one more genuine because it was for her. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about all the fun you're having today." She studied me with that piercing gaze children use when they know adults are hiding something. "Daddy says thinking too much can make you sad. Maybe you should play instead of think." Her innocent wisdom struck me as profoundly true. When had I stopped playing? When had I become so focused on observing and analyzing that I forgot how to simply enjoy the moment? Maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe I had withdrawn so much into my own thoughts that I had become invisible to others. The conversation near the door was continuing. I found myself unable to stop listening despite the pain it caused. Jennifer had joined Patricia and Mark, adding her own observations to their impromptu psychological evaluation. "I worry about him driving," Jennifer was saying. Last week when he picked up Emma for their museum trip, it took him forever to parallel park. Cars were backing up behind him, and he seemed completely oblivious. That particular incident had been frustrating, I'll admit. The parking space had been tight, and my depth perception wasn't what it used to be. But I had successfully parked. The car, and Emma and I had enjoyed a wonderful afternoon at the Natural History Museum. She had been fascinated by the dinosaur exhibits, and we had spent hours discussing extinction and evolution. Why did they focus on the parking struggle rather than the successful outing that followed? Maybe it's time someone had a serious conversation. With David about taking his dad's keys away, Mark suggested, before something happens. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. My car wasn't just transportation. It was independence, freedom, the ability to go where I wanted when I wanted. The thought of losing that autonomy was terrifying in a way I couldn't adequately express. Driving was one of the last remaining activities that made me feel competent and in control of my own life. Emma had wandered off to join some other children who were playing with sidewalk chalk, leaving me alone with the weight of what I had overheard. I sat there feeling increasingly isolated, wondering if this was how it would be from now on, family gatherings where I was discussed rather than included, where my limitations were cataloged and my remaining abilities ignored. The sun was sinking lower, casting longer shadows across the yard. A few families had already left, their children clutching goodie bags and new toys, while parents exchanged promises to get together soon. The party was winding down, but the conversations about my supposed decline seemed to be gaining momentum. David appeared at my side again, this time carrying a plate of leftover cake. "Thought you might want seconds," he said, settling back into the chair beside me. His presence was immediately comforting, a barrier between me and the voices that had been dissecting my capabilities. "Thanks, son. Emma's had a good day, hasn't she?" "The best."
Asked.
"She's already asking when her next birthday will be." David chuckled, but I could sense something else in his demeanor attention that hadn't been there earlier. Had he overheard some of the conversations too? Was he starting to have his own doubts about my independence? We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Emma and her remaining friends chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The sight should have been purely joyful, but I found myself wondering how many more family gatherings I would attend before I became too much of a burden to include. The second chapter of this pivotal day was drawing to a close, and I felt the weight of every whispered concern, every sideways glance, every suggestion that I was no longer the man I once was. But deep inside, beneath the hurt and frustration, something else was stirring, a stubborn determination that refused to accept their diminished version of who I had become. They saw an old man fading away, but I knew there was still fire left. In me, stories yet to be told, and a legacy that deserved more than their casual dismissal. The evening had settled over David's backyard like a comfortable blanket, with string lights casting a warm glow over the remaining party guests. Most of the children had been rounded up and taken home, their sugar-fueled energy finally giving way to exhaustion. Only a core group of family members remained, the ones who lived nearby and felt no urgency to end the gathering. These were also, unfortunately, the same people who had spent the afternoon discussing my supposed deterioration. Emma was showing signs of fatigue herself, though she fought against it with the determination of someone who knew good things ended. When you fell asleep, she had claimed the spot on my lap, her small body warm against my chest as she fought to keep her eyes open. Her presence was a comfort I desperately needed as the conversations around us continued to flow with the easy familiarity of people who had known each other for decades. "Dad, why don't you tell Emma one of your stories?" David suggested, settling into the chair beside us with a fresh beer in hand. His voice carried a note of encouragement that made me wonder if he had sensed my growing isolation throughout the afternoon. "She's been asking about them all day." I felt Emma perk up in my arms, her fatigue temporarily forgotten. "Yes, Grandpa Joe, tell me about the soldiers."
Daddy said that he laughs.
"You knew lots of brave soldiers." The request should have filled me with pleasure. For years, I had been the family storyteller, the keeper of memories and adventures that spanned decades. But after everything I had overheard that afternoon, I found myself hesitating. Would they see storytelling as another sign of my decline? An old man living in memories because the present had become too difficult to navigate? I don't know if anyone wants to hear old war stories, I said carefully, testing the waters. They're not exactly party conversation. Well, come on, Uncle Joe, called out Michael from across the patio, where he was helping Susan clean up. We love your stories. Tell us about that time you saved those guys in Korea. The invitation seemed genuine, but I had learned to be wary of false encouragement. Still, Emma was looking up at me with such expectation that I found myself nodding. Slowly, maybe it was time to remind them all who I used to be, who I still was, despite their assumptions about my decline. Well, I began, adjusting Emma's position so she could hear better. This was back in 1951, during one of the coldest winters Korea had ever seen. I was just a young sergeant then, not much older than your daddy is now. As I spoke, I could feel the attention of the remaining family members gradually focusing on me. It had been months since I had told one of my stories at a family gathering, and I realized how much I had missed the feeling of holding an audience captive with words. We were stationed near the chosen reservoir, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each sentence. The Chinese had us surrounded, and the temperature was dropping to 40 below zero. Men were getting frostbite so bad they couldn't hold their rifles. But we had a job to do. We had to get medical supplies to a unit that was cut off about 2 miles north of our position. Emma's eyes were wide with fascination, but I noticed that some of the adults had begun to drift back to their own conversations. Patricia was scrolling through her phone, and Mark was deep in discussion with Jennifer about their weekend plans. The realization stung, but I pressed on for Emma's sake. The thing about war, I said, looking down at my granddaughter's upturned face, is that it shows you what people are really made of. Some folks discover they're braver than they ever imagined, and others, I paused, thinking about friends who hadn't made it home. Others give everything they have to make sure their buddies get to see their families again. Were you scared, Grandpa? Emma asked, her small hand finding mine. Terrified, I admitted. But sometimes being scared is what keeps you alive long enough to do what needs to be done. I was about to continue when I heard Patricia's voice cutting through the evening air. Not quite whispered, but not intended for my ears either. Here we go again with the war stories, she said to Mark, her tone carrying that familiar note of tolerant exasperation. Poor Emma's going to be bored to tears. The words hit me like a slap. Poor Emma. I looked down at my granddaughter, who was hanging on every word with the kind of attention most adults would kill for. She wasn't bored, she was entranced, transported, to a world of courage and sacrifice that most people her age would never have to consider. But Patricia's comment had its intended effect. My voice faltered, the momentum of the story broken by the casual dismissal. I found myself wondering if I had been boring them all these years. If my stories were just the ramblings of an old man who couldn't let go of his past. Don't stop, Grandpa, Emma urged, sensing my hesitation. What happened next? Did you save them? Before I could answer, David stood up abruptly from his chair. There was something in his posture, tension I hadn't seen before, that made everyone look in his direction. He walked to the sliding glass door and disappeared into the house, leaving the rest of us wondering what had prompted his sudden departure. Where's Daddy going? Emma asked, but her question was lost in the shuffle as other family members began to speculate about David's mood. Maybe he's getting more drinks, Susan suggested, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. He seemed upset about something, Jennifer observed, her phone finally forgotten as she focused on the house. I found myself wondering the same thing. David had been nothing but supportive throughout the afternoon, but maybe he too was growing. Tired of his father's presence? Maybe he had reached the same conclusion as the others, that I was becoming more burden than blessing, more obligation than joy. Emma had settled back against my chest, content to wait for her story to continue. Her trust was absolute, her faith in my ability to transport her to another world unshaken by the adults' subtle dismissals. If only I could see myself through her eyes, instead of through the lens of family members who had apparently decided I was past my prime. The sliding door opened. David emerged from the house carrying something in his hands. At first I couldn't make out what it was, a small box or container of some kind. But as he walked toward us, his expression serious and determined, I began to recognize the shape and size of something I hadn't seen in years. My heart began to pound as David approached. The small wooden box cradled carefully in his hands. I knew what was inside that box, though I couldn't understand why he had retrieved it or what he planned to do with it. The conversations around us had died away as everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. David stopped. In front of my chair, Emma still curled in my lap and looked directly into my eyes. There was something fierce in his expression, something protective and proud that I hadn't seen since he was a young man defending his choices to skeptical relatives. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet patio, "I think it's time everyone here learned something about the man they've been talking about all afternoon." The words sent a chill down my spine. He had heard them. He had heard the whispered assessments, the casual dismissals, the suggestions about my declining abilities. And now, he was about to do something that would change everything, though. I still couldn't guess what. Emma sat up straighter in my lap, sensing the gravity of the moment, even if she couldn't understand its significance. The other family members had stopped their side conversations and were now focused entirely on David and the mysterious box in his hands. "You want to know who this tired old man really is?" David continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You want to know what kind of person you've been casually writing off all afternoon?" He opened the box with careful, reverent movements, and even in the dim light of the string bulbs, the contents gleamed with an unmistakable authority. The Bronze Star medal lay nestled in its velvet lining, the ribbon still bright despite the passage of decades. The medal still capable of catching and reflecting light like captured fire. The silence that followed was profound and immediate. Every whispered conversation stopped. Every dismissive assumption hung frozen in the evening air. In that moment, I felt the weight of recognition beginning to shift the entire dynamic of the gathering. Emma's small voice broke the silence with the pure wonder that only children possess. "Grandpa Joe, what's that beautiful star?" And suddenly, I realized that the third chapter of this pivotal day was about to become something I never could have anticipated, not an ending, but a beginning. The Bronze Star medal seemed to pulse with its own inner light as David held it aloft for everyone to see. The evening air, which had been filled with casual chatter and the distant sounds of suburban life just moments before, now carried a weight of reverence that none of us had expected. Emma's question, "Grandpa Joe, what's that beautiful star?" In the silence, like a prayer waiting to be answered, I felt every eye in the gathering turn toward me. But this time, the attention was different. Gone were the sideways glances and whispered assessments. Instead, I saw something I hadn't witnessed in months: genuine curiosity, respect, and perhaps even a touch of shame from those who had spent the afternoon dismissing me as a tired old man who had outlived his relevance. David's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a strength and pride that made my chest tighten with emotion. "This," he said, lifting the medal higher so the string lights caught its bronze surface, "is the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device. It's awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement or service in a combat zone." He paused, letting the significance of those words settle over the group before continuing. "My father earned this medal on November 27th, 1951. During the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in Korea, he was 22 years old, younger than most of you, when he risked his life to save 8 men from his unit who were trapped behind enemy lines. Patricia's phone had disappeared completely, her attention now riveted on the medal and the story unfolding before us. Mark stood with his mouth slightly open, his earlier suggestions about my declining mental faculties apparently forgotten. Jennifer had moved closer, her children forgotten as she strained to hear every word. Emma shifted in my lap, her small hand reaching toward the medal with the instinctive reverence children show for things they recognize as important. "Can I touch it, Grandpa?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak immediately. As her tiny fingers traced the ribbon and the bronze star itself, I found my voice returning, along with memories I had kept locked away for decades. "It was the coldest I'd ever been in my life," I began, the words coming easier now that I could. "See," I had their full attention. 43 degrees below zero, and we'd been cut off from our main unit for 6 days. We were low on ammunition, out of medical supplies, and the Chinese forces had us surrounded. The story that had been interrupted earlier now flowed with a clarity and power that surprised even me. Perhaps it was the presence of the metal itself. Or maybe it was the knowledge that finally someone was listening, not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. 8 of my men were wounded in an ambush, I continued. Emma's warm weight in my lap grounding me to the present, even as my mind traveled back to those frozen Korean hillsides. They were trapped in a bunker about 200 yards from our position, but the enemy had machine gun nests covering all the approaches. Every time we tried to reach them, we took heavy fire. David had settled back into his chair, the metal box balanced carefully on his knee. His expression was one of intense pride, but also something else in perhaps. At the relatives who had spent the day diminishing the man whose courage had been recognized by his country, the lieutenant wanted to wait for artillery support. I went on, but we could hear our guys calling for help, and we knew some of them were bleeding out. Waiting meant watching good men die while we played it safe. "What did you do?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I volunteered to create a distraction," I said, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday. The plan was for me to draw their fire from the east while a rescue team approached from the west. It was dangerous, probably stupid, but it was the only chance those men had. I could see the family members exchanging glances, beginning to understand that the man they had been discussing in diminished terms had once been capable of extraordinary courage. The contrast between their afternoon assumptions and the reality of what I had done 67 years earlier was stark and undeniable. I took a Barra Browning automatic rifle and enough ammunition to keep those machine gunners busy for a while.
Wow.
Then I worked my way around to a position where I could lay down covering fire. The technical details came back to me with surprising clarity: the weight of the weapon, the bite of the Korean wind, the sound of enemy bullets striking the rocks around my position. But more than that, I remembered the faces of the men I was trying to save. Young soldiers not much older than David had been when he graduated from college. For 20 minutes, I kept their attention focused on my position while the rescue team moved in from behind. I went through 4 magazines of ammunition, and by the time our guys reached the wounded men, the Chinese were closing in on my position from 3 sides. "How did you get out?" This question came from Michael, who had abandoned his cleanup duties to listen with the kind of attention he usually reserved for his work presentations. "Luck, mostly," I admitted, and the fact that our guys laid down covering fire while I made a run for it. I took shrapnel in my left leg and my shoulder, but all 8 of those wounded men made it out alive. Emma was studying my face with new eyes, as if seeing me for the first time. "Did it hurt, Grandpa?" "Everything hurt for a while," I said gently, "but knowing those men got to go home to their families made it worth it." Susan had joined the circle now, her hostess duties forgotten in favor of a story she had never heard in the 30 years she had been part of this family. "Joe, I had no idea. Why don't you ever talk about this?" The question was fair, and it deserved an honest answer, because for a long time it felt like ancient history, something that happened to a different person in a different world. I came home, built a business, raised my boys, and tried to focus on the future instead of the past. Davi Hosh at my granddaughter's birthday, they said I was just a tired old man. Then my son pulled out my bronze star.